Hey everyone, Gabby here from Bootcamp.com, and for today's video, we'll be talking about the location and borders of the infratemporal fossa, also known as the IT fossa. Now, the actual location of the IT fossa can be a bit difficult to visualize, so I've given you different views or different pictures here to hopefully facilitate that for you. So as the name implies, infra means below, so the infratemporal fossa is going to be below the temporal fossa. Now, the temporal fossa is located here along the temporal bone, where our temporalis muscle, one of our muscles of mastication, is going to sit. So just below that temporal fossa, so where these arrows or this yellow arrow is indicating, is going to be where that infratemporal fossa is located. We can also look at this inferior view of the skull. We can see this right here is going to be the mandible here and here, because we can see the teeth. So within these yellow dotted lines, you can see the location of the infratemporal fossa, and we can better appreciate how it's really deep to the mandible. So again, the mandible is here, so we're really looking on the inside of the mandible. So in order to form the borders of the infratemporal fossa, we have bony structures that are found within the skull that are going to assist us with forming these borders. Now, we're going to talk about specifically which bony structures are going to, contribute to these borders. Now, if we look at our image here, so here's going to be the mandible, and if we were to remove this bony structure here called the temporal process that attaches with the zygomatic bone, we could see that the infratemporal fossa is deep, right? It's deep, and it's deep within the mandible. So now let's start talking about our borders. So our first border is going to be our superior border. So I've given you a cube here to help you maybe visualize the borders a little bit better when we talk about superior, anterior, posterior, and yada, yada, yada. It might be easier to actually picture this with the cube in mind, with those colors in mind. So the greater wing of the sphenoid bone that we can see here is going to be forming that superior border of that infratemporal fossa. So remember that the sphenoid bone kind of looks like this long butterfly, and towards the ends or the edges of the sphenoid bone on either side, we have these wings and that kind of flare out a little bit. So here we're going to have our greater wing of the sphenoid bone that's going to really be contributing to the roof or the superior border of that infratemporal fossa. Next, posteriorly, we're going to see the styloid process of the temporal bone. So remember that styloid process, it's a very, very thin, slightly long structure that is very fragile, in fact, but this styloid process is going to be coming off our temporal bone here and essentially forming that posterior border of the infratemporal fossa. Now, the inferior border of the infratemporal fossa is going to be formed by our medial pterygoid muscle, which you can see here. Now, I've drawn it in because this image didn't have the medial pterygoid attached to it, but nonetheless, the medial pterygoid is going to be one of our muscles of mastication that's going to help us move the jaw, and it's going to be found slightly more inferiorly compared to our other pterygoid muscle, like our lateral pterygoid. So that medial pterygoid is more inferior, so it's going to be forming the floor of the infratemporal fossa. Now, the anterior border of the IT fossa is going to be formed by the maxilla. And remember that the maxilla is what houses our upper teeth, or what really forms our upper jaw. So it's in this region here along the maxilla where that anterior border of the infratemporal fossa is going to be located. So if you look at our cube here, I just want to make note that I did not include the anterior wall because I wanted you to better appreciate all of the other borders. Next, our medial border is going to be the lateral pterygoid plate of the sphenoid bone. So here's the sphenoid bone again. So we said that the greater wing of the sphenoid is going to be forming the superior border. Well, that lateral pterygoid plate that is found slightly more posteriorly along the sphenoid bone and more inferiorly is going to be forming our medial border. Lastly, I mentioned that the infratemporal fossa was deep within the mandible. So naturally, that mandible is going to serve as one of our borders. Specifically, is going to be forming our lateral borders. So we can see here how the mandible has actually been brought down slightly more inferiorly so you can better visualize the space. So it's really within this location here that we're going to have the infratemporal fossa. But that mandible is also going to be forming that lateral border, but more specifically, the regions of the mandible are going to be the condylar process. So the condylar process is what actually articulates to form the temporomandibular joint. And then we're also going to see that border formed by the ramus of the mandible. So here's our image again, and I think again, this image really helps to better appreciate the location and the borders of the infratemporal fossa. So here again, we said the superior border was going to be our greater wing of the sphenoid. We had our posterior border here coming off of the temporal bone, which is our styloid process. We then had in this area here, we're going to have the medial pterygoid kind of sitting along the inferior aspects of the infratemporal fossa that is going to be forming our floor or inferior border of that infratemporal fossa. And then here we can see the regions of the maxilla that are going to form the anterior border. And then also we can see that medial border here, again, closer to the midline, that's going to be formed by our lateral pterygoid plate of our sphenoid bone. So sphenoid bone is going to be contributing to our superior border as well as our medial border. And then we can see again the mandible here with the condylar process and the actual ramus itself are going to be forming the lateral borders. All right, so let's see what you've learned today. So identify the bones that contribute to the borders of the IT fossa, and then which muscle provides the inferior border of the IT fossa. So pause the video and then come on back when you're ready. So we said that the sphenoid bone is going to contribute to two borders. This greater wing of the sphenoid, which you can see right here, is going to be forming our superior border. Then the lateral pterygoid plate that's going to be forming our medial border is going to be seen right there. And along the inferior aspects, the temporal bone, we have our styloid process there that's going to be forming our posterior border. We talked about the maxilla, which we can see here housing the upper teeth that are going to be forming really that anterior border in this location here if we were to remove the mandible. We also said because the infratemporal fossa is deep to the mandibles, that mandible will contribute to one of our borders. So we said that the condylar process and the ramus of the mandible are going to be contributing to our lateral borders of our IT fossa. And then which muscle provides the inferior border of the IT fossa? And that's going to be the medial pterygoid. So remember, the medial pterygoid is going to be, again, deep to the mandible, but is going to be sitting kind of along these regions here to form, the inferior border of the floor of the infratemporal fossa. Here are the references for the images that I used today, and I hope you enjoyed this video on the location and borders of the infratemporal fossa. Please let me know if you have any questions.